Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cary Carson.
Thank you, Carter. I don't know who is embarrassed more of Baby Smith or me. It's been a long, long time since you were that age and I first met you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, friends of Drayton Hall, Charlestonians, and whomever else is here, good evening. Thank you very much. I am very grateful for the invitation that brings me to this podium. And I must say that I am very grateful, too, for the remarkable hospitality that my wife and her sister, both from the Netherlands, have enjoyed in these yesterday and today. You have been, you have been yourselves. You have been Charlestonians in extending a gracious welcome to us. For them, for my wife and my sister-in-law, their first time in Charleston. As Carter has just explained, I had the pleasure of running the research division at Colonial Williamsburg for almost 30 years. The division already had a storied history long before I came along. In fact, I was number 5 in the string of research directors, going all the way back to 1927. So it's not surprising that I was asked many times, can there really be anything left to learn about a town that has been so exhaustively studied for 50 years? Were my colleagues and I really making new discoveries? Or were we just grinding the same old facts into finer and finer particles? Now, it's true. Once in a while, historians do turn up new documents, new historical evidence seen for the first time. And that happens much more often for archaeologists, of course. Be that as it may, it usually isn't new discoveries that lead to new ways of understanding the past. Much more often, it's new questions that send historians off in search of fresh perspectives. I offer my talk this evening as proof that students of the past can indeed pour old wine into new bottles. It's what keeps us employed and interesting to audiences like you, generation after generation. Let me see. Oops, one moment. A couple of years ago, as Carter mentioned, the University of North Carolina Press published a book that had been long in the making in the research division at Colonial Williamsburg. Some of you may actually know it. It's called The Chesapeake House. It mentions in passing 3 remarkable Virginia buildings that I want to spend more time talking about this evening. There are 3 of some 400 structures featured in this book. Here tonight, we're going to take a closer look at just this trio. My colleagues and I did make a number of new discoveries in the course of research on the book, but these 3 structures featured tonight were not among the new finds. All had been more or less known from old photographs in one case, or from archaeological excavations carried out decades earlier. Since that time, though, the study of early American history has explored interpretive dimensions not previously foreseen. So it happened that we gradually came to believe that these 3 unusual early buildings hold the key to understanding something important about the development of Virginia's society before and after 1700, something historians didn't suspect before. This evening, I'll tell you how and what and why revisiting scenes from the American past can sometimes produce genuine surprises. Sir William Barclay Lewis Burrell II and Robert King Carter are legends in early Virginia history. All three left behind architectural legacies, great country houses, all long gone, but all excavated in modern times by professional archaeologists. This is an aerial view of Governor Barclay's plantation at Green Spring at the time of its excavation in 1956. Green Spring is the earliest and best known of the three extraordinary structures I'll talk about this evening. Barclay began building his mansion house in 1643, finished it 2 years later, and as we'll see, significantly enlarged it shortly after 1660. A generation later, Lewis Burrell used his wife's inheritance to build this structure in 1694. Fairfield, as it's called, survived long enough to get its picture taken, but just barely. It burned down in the 1890s. Archaeologists have been excavating its remains for the past 13 years. Fast forward another generation to 1727. That's when Robert Carter, King Carter to those who knew and feared him, finally finished building Coratoman. It's the third, and as far as we know, the last of these unusual structures. I say unusual. What do I mean? Let me call your attention to two features that you can clearly see in this 1978 photograph of the excavations at Coratoman. They were ably carried out by Carter Hudgens Sr. Hudgens the Elder, I understand he's referred to around here. Actually, I would know him rather as the Venerable Hudgens, or Hudgens of legend. The first thing to notice in this photograph is the extraordinary length of this building, 93 feet. Very long, but very narrow proportionately. Coratoman was only one room deep, only 30 feet wide. Now, also notice a second unusual feature. Observe that foundations for a gallery or, oops, that's the wrong button, sorry. Foundations for a veranda or gallery ran across the full length of the building in the front, right here. Here's a plan of those excavated footings, Coratoman on top. For comparison, let's set Coratoman alongside Fairfield, there on the left, and on the right, Green Spring Lodge. You'll see that all three bear a family resemblance. All three were exceptionally long, narrow buildings. Coratoman, 93 feet, Fairfield, 63, and Green Spring, a whopping 97. Furthermore, all three were fronted with some kind of end-to-end veranda. Students of early Virginia architecture have long puzzled over these unconventional plans. Until now, they've not reached a logical explanation for their eccentricities. Until now, we didn't know really where they come from. They haven't been identified by comparable English buildings that might have served as models. And they never will, according to British architectural historian Nicholas Cooper. He's the author of this definitive study of 16th and 17th century country houses in Britain. When he saw the ground plan of Green Spring, he expressed surprise. The plan is very odd for a dwelling, he told me. Its huge single pile would be considered in England quite exceptionally archaic. By single pile, he meant its narrow one-room width. No back rooms, in other words. Just a string of front rooms end to end. Very odd indeed. Yet the conventional wisdom in Virginia has always held that Green Spring, Fairfield, and Coratoman were simply way over the top, eye-popping plantation houses, the McMansions of their day. So my talk this evening starts with a puzzle, or more accurately, a puzzle within a puzzle. The first begs an architectural solution. Were these enormous, oddball structures really just extravagant dwelling houses, archaic or not? The solution to the second enigma, what can Green Spring, Fairfield, and Coratoman tell us about life in early colonial Virginia that we didn't know before their excavation? Well, answering that is worth saving for the end. First things first, did the original builder owners of these structures actually live in them? Or did they serve some other different purpose? Come back to Coratoman for a minute and consider this. King Carter was a very unlucky man. He took 6 or 7 years to build the building that we know from archaeology. It was finally ready to use in 1727. Scarcely 2 years later, it burned to the ground. 4 years after that, Carter himself was dead. Those two events, the fire and his death, left behind evidence that helps us to answer the question about the use of this structure. The 1729 fire was an inferno. It burned so fast and so hot that it melted glass and fused stacked ceramic bowls into solid agglomerations like you see here. Carter's people can't have rescued much from the blaze. Yet when the appraisers inventoried his possessions after his death in 1732, less than 4 years later, his entire library remained intact and unharmed in the house next door where he'd been living for 50 years. There's no way so many books could have been carried away from the burning building. Furthermore, the shelves in his old house were still crammed with the accumulated possessions of a lifetime. They add up to many more expensive furnishings than a broken, sickly old man could have replaced in the space of just 2 or 3 years after the fire. Logic admits only one conclusion. Carter never moved out of the house that his last will and testament calls my mansion dwelling. That's probably the structure that archaeologists located about here, when they surveyed the property initially. The much larger structure that they then excavated, the one you see here, Carter called that one the new house in 1726, just as it was nearing completion. Of course, history is full of exceptions, things that happened only once or twice. Maybe Coratoman was one of those. Maybe Carter just never got around to moving into the new house. I don't think so. Carter's 93-foot extravaganza was not an exception. This is Fairfield again, the building Lewis Burrell built in 1694. And what do you know? It too was paired with another substantial structure nearby. Years ago, an archaeologist from colonial Williamsburg discovered the remains of another house-like building adjacent to this one. When he finished removing the debris from the cellar, he found this dated bottle seal on the paved floor. It bears the date 1704. That means it can't have been thrown into the abandoned cellar until at least 10 years after Burrell built house number 2 in 1694. And that means that both structures were used at the same time, at least for a while. So again, we find another great Virginia planter continuing to reside in a substantial older house while spending a fortune, in Burrell's case, his wife's fortune, to build a second, grander structure immediately next door. Why? There's no way to ignore this conundrum at Green Spring. Sir William Barclay's country house outside Jamestown. There, the governor's 15-room dwelling was physically attached to the even larger other building. For now, let's call this addition the Lodge. Here you see the foundations of the two structures as archaeologists uncovered them. The house is on the right here. The lodge was attached to this end of it here, to the left. The dwelling part was built and ready to move into in 1645. The lodge was built about 15 years later. One did not replace the other. We know they stood side by side. How do we know? This document proves it. The land surveyor who drew this plat in 1683 added a little sketch of the governor's house at the top. Green Spring was a conspicuous landmark. Although it's only a thumbnail sketch, the drawing clearly shows the lodge here, still attached to the two-story mansion house here. So, what have we learned? That in Virginia, archaeologists have discovered 3 enormous early structures that don't conform to familiar house types either in the colony or in Great Britain. Furthermore, there's reason to believe that all 3, large as they were not built to replace the older residences that their wealthy owners still called home. That begs the question, what function did these monumental lodges serve? The biographies of the 3 owner builders give no clues. All were fabulously wealthy men, but they came from quite different backgrounds. Sir William Barclay was British-born. He was a courtier in the service of Charles I until he took up an appointment as governor of the colony of Virginia. He remained in the colony for the rest of his life. Robert Carter was born here. As a young man, he was schooled in England, then returned to the colony, where he eventually inherited his father's vast land holdings and enormous slave labor force. Like Carter, Louis Burrell II of Fairfield was also a Virginian by birth. He never left the colony, not to have his portrait painted and never to see English examples of the sophisticated architectural style he chose for Fairfield. That alone redoubles the mystery at Fairfield, as we shall see. These 3 grandees did share one thing in common. They numbered among the earliest fashion leaders in Virginia. They were tops, but they weren't alone. Beginning with the restoration of the monarchy in England and the return of royal government to the colonies in 1660, emigrants to the Chesapeake colonies included a more cosmopolitan breed of men and women than the hard-scrabble bunch that had clawed their way to the top of Virginia's society in the first half of the 17th century. The newcomers soon married into the older families, and before long, they came to dominate local politics and provincial affairs. Some discovered that they could climb the social ladder farther and faster if they adopted a style of living that closely followed an international cosmopolitan model of refinement and gentility. Polite behavior and artificial good manners needed fashionable accessories. They also required appropriate architectural settings in which to perform the activities that came to be expected of true ladies and gentlemen. Not every wealthy planter bought into this beau ideal at first, even when they could afford it. Those who did, historians are finding, tended to be men who had close connections with fellow office holders and magistrates at home and with trading houses and government officials back in England. Many were relative newcomers to the colonies. The point worth noting is this: they were the very people who relied on fashionable dress and stylized good manners to identify social equals even among strangers and to entertain them appropriately wherever their paths might cross. Their paths crossed most conveniently and frequently in ports and towns, even for country gentlemen who had city business that brought them together in urban places. That was as true in England as it was in England's colonies. London, the metropolis, was always the fashion mecca. But gentility eventually transformed many old-fashioned English market towns into gentry watering holes. The spa town of Bath, seen here, was only the most illustrious. It and other gentry towns across the British Isles built playhouses, assembly rooms, racetracks, clubs, and coffee houses where people of taste could flock together with birds of the same feather. The problem was that towns were slow to take root around the Chesapeake Bay, where isolated plantations and country stores lay inland along many navigable waterways. This carefully reconstructed and researched artists' recreation of Jamestown, the 17th century capital of Virginia, accurately illustrates the brisk commercial traffic that periodically brought this rustic town to life during court seasons. But like this 1697 view of a courthouse hamlet in Maryland, the street scene at Jamestown shows how bereft Tidewater towns were of the genteel amenities that increasingly drew sophisticated Britons to spa towns and provincial capitals in England. For the entire period I'm talking about this evening, Maryland and Virginia were overwhelmingly rural settlements. Here and there, scattered landings, collected wharves and warehouses along the riverbanks. Inland, a few general stores and roadside taverns clustered around county courthouses located at convenient crossroads. Full-service gentry towns like Annapolis here, Norfolk, and Williamsburg came into their own only after 1750 or so. Not until the second half of the 18th century could people of quality go to a nearby town and expect to find accommodations suitable for displaying their sophistication and good manners. That said, the desire to keep company with other social butterflies went back 2 generations at least. Even before this elegant portrait of Daniel Park was painted about 1705, aspiring ladies and gentlemen in the southern colonies did get all dressed up. The question is, where could they go to preen and parade their elegance and sophistication? Archaeologists and architectural historians have discovered part of the answer. They understand, and now you should too, that the vast majority of planters lived plain, hard-scrabble lives in small 1- and 2-room houses like this one, recreated at St. Mary's City, Maryland. Tenant farmers, indentured servants, and African and Indian slaves fared worse, of course. Among successful tobacco planters, all but a few were strangers to fashion before 1700. Most Virginians and Marylanders lived in frame-built, clapboard-covered farmhouses devoid of refinements. For almost 200 years, even better-built farmhouses resembled this one in Cumberland County, Virginia. It was sketched by Benjamin Latrobe at the end of the 18th century. More than 100 years earlier, a traveler through the region described the standard dwelling he encountered everywhere he went. Whatever their rank, he wrote, planters build only 2 rooms, with some closets on the ground floor and 2 rooms in the attic above. They build also a separate kitchen, a separate house for the Christian servants, and one for the Negro slaves. Here, you're looking at the excavated foundations of one such house, albeit a very upscale version. John Page built his house in Williamsburg in 1662. The future colonial capital was still just a crossroads settlement called Middle Plantation. I call it upscale, not because it was larger than most houses. It still had only two main rooms on the ground floor, a hall and a parlor, in effect, a living room and a master bedroom. The other rooms that you see here, this was an open porch, and back here, this was this extension contained the staircase. But otherwise, it had a hall on the ground floor and a parlor next to it. Unlike most of his neighbors, Page's house was unusual insofar as it was brick, not frame. Rooms in pairs may have satisfied most men of rank, but not all. A few grandees aspired to live no less splendidly than did English country gentlemen. The earliest and grandest of all was a man you've already met, Sir William Barclay. He'd been a courtier back home before his appointment as governor of Virginia. Anticipating his arrival in the colony in 1643, he built an enormous 15-room brick mansion on his country estate 4 miles outside Jamestown. The dwelling house at Green Spring looked something like this. This drawing is an educated guess by me and an architectural draftsman. We based it on information recovered from several archaeological excavations conducted on the site. The layout of rooms conformed in most respects to a very familiar British house type of the period. For comparison, I show you an illustration from an English publication of 1613. That's on the right. In both of these drawings, a great hall in the center separated two wings, two cross wings. This one, over here, and at Green Spring here, was the service wing. Here were the kitchens, pantries, and other storage rooms for food and drink. The other wing, here and here, accommodated the family's living quarters and guest rooms. For instance, this space on the 1613 diagram is labeled the dining parlor for the entertainment of strangers. What I'm doing here is showing you that as early as the 1640s, there were dwelling houses in Virginia that did provide the same generous, entertaining spaces that ladies and gentlemen were accustomed to in Britain. Green Spring may have been, as Lady Barclay boasted, the finest seat in America, but it was not the only residence built with an eye to hospitality. At one time or another, some of you have visited Bacon's Castle, I suspect, now a historic house museum owned and operated by Preservation Virginia. It was built in 1665 and is today the oldest surviving house in the Old South. Arthur Allen, the builder, could entertain his guests in a dining parlor on the ground floor here. Got away here, yes, here. Sorry, I jumped the gun there. That would be first one. Right up. Back. There. The dining parlor was here, there. But the superior and most companionable rooms were located upstairs. There, a great chamber, which you see here, was furnished with a set of imported cane chairs for no less than a dozen guests. They were received in these upstairs rooms at daytime soirees with Major Allen while he took his ease on a matching cane couch. There were other great 17th century Virginia mansions that mimicked British solutions to entertaining courteously at home. This house, called Arlington, was built in 1675 by John Custis II in Northampton County on the eastern shore. Here, front and back rooms on the first and second floors included no fewer than 4 public spaces. A so-called great parlor upstairs may have served as a withdrawing room to Custis's own well-furnished bedchamber, as at Bacon's Castle. Clearly, a few forward-looking gentlemen were experimenting with true upstairs-downstairs plans by the fourth quarter of the 17th century. The advantage was that they vacated the principal ground floor for genteel living exclusively. Archaeologists, as you see here in Maryland, have recently excavated a country seat so modern that it rivaled many gentry houses in Britain toward the end of the 17th century. Merchant planter Samuel Chew II built this very large double-pile brick mansion in the late 1690s. The most plausible layout of rooms based on the archaeological plan clears the main floor for one purpose only. Fashionable living occupied a brace of 4 handsome rooms on either side of a stone-floored entrance hall. Kitchens, pantries, and laundries appear to have been pushed downstairs into a full cellar or parceled out to nearby outbuildings. A generation later, many large gentry houses in the Chesapeake region and here in South Carolina as well would follow this model for organizing the flow of servant traffic up and down cellar stairs or from outside kitchens and dairies. Samuel Chew's house was a forerunner that showed the way. Now, I could finish this talk right here this evening, and you'd have got your money's worth. I've already shown you 3 or 4 great plantation houses that you've seldom or never seen before. All flourished before 1700. All but Bacon's castle vanished long ago. All have been rediscovered in modern times by professional archaeologists. All have now been studied, and many of their secrets more or less figured out. But my talk doesn't end here. Not yet. We still haven't solved the mystery that lies at the heart of the 3 very large, very curious structures that opened this lecture: the big addition to Green Spring, Fairfield, and Coratoman. I've shown you these other gentry-level houses to illustrate a crucial distinction. These others were all residences, dwelling houses. Not only did their owners and families inhabit them day in and day and night, in every case, they were deliberately built to receive, entertain, and lodge visiting ladies and gentlemen, that is to say, the planters' social equals. What we see in this quest for bigger, better entertaining rooms is the Restoration gentleman expanding the boundaries of his self-made fashionable persona. At first, it could be compassed in the same spaces from which servants and slaves had been expelled when not in service. Not for long. As good manners and good company loomed ever larger in a well-bred person's everyday life, rooms with specialized functions enlarged his or her house. Eventually, even the 4 walls of an a la mode residence, even a Bacon's Castle in Arlington or a Chew House, could no longer provide a large enough playing field to give such alpha gentlemen and their alpha friends sufficient free rein to parade their magnificence. Flocking to nearby gentry towns was the obvious recourse. So it was throughout provincial England. But, as I've already explained, fashionable towns did not make their appearance in Virginia and Maryland until the middle of the 18th century. Was there then no place for dressed-up people to go in the long decades before 1750? You see where I'm headed here. I know the suspense is almost too much to bear. So let me come right out and give away the ending. Actually, better yet, let 4 gentlemen of the period tell you the punchline in their own words. In 1670, 4 planters on the northern neck of Virginia went together to build what they called a banqueting house. These subscribers, later remembered as that never-to-be-forgotten quartet of bon vivants, built their clubhouse in a location convenient to all four, according to their signed agreement. Their goal, they said, was to promote, quote, the continuance of good neighborhood. Every May, each man in rotation was obliged, again in their own words, to make an honorable treatment fit to entertain the undertakers thereof, their wives, mistresses, and friends, yearly and every year. In other words, here were four guys who were not willing to wait around another 70 or 80 years for urban Virginia to get its act together. Instead, they took Bacchus by the horns, went out, and built their own private party-hardy clubhouse. Here, finally, is the explanation we've been looking for. The archaeological excavations at Green Spring, Fairfield, and Coratoman have brought to light not 3 brand new, up-to-the-minute, over-the-top dwelling houses, but 3 brand new, up-to-the-minute, over-the-top banqueting houses. They were built as private clubhouses for Barclays, Burrells, and Carter's neighbors, friends, and guests. The banquet house, built by the 4 gentlemen from Westmoreland County, was early, 1670, but it was not the first. So far as anyone knows, that distinction belongs to Sir William Barclay. He assembled a large workforce and broke ground for this super ambitious addition to his Green Spring mansion, probably as early as the 1660s, as soon as it became clear that the restoration of the crown in Britain would lead to his own reappointment in Virginia. Thanks to archaeology, we know that services in the banqueting lodge at Green Spring were divided between floors, and that the large rooms upstairs were given over exclusively to entertainment. Barclay's guests entered the lodge by ascending a double staircase that rose from a garden in front of the house to a landing on the long open gallery. This should remind you of the riverfront, frankly, of Drayton Hall. There, on that gallery, they might pause to admire handsome garden parterres down below, or Barclay's Deer Park in the distance. Proceeding inside, they passed through a porch tower into one of 3 almost equally large rooms, ranged side by side, each with its own fireplace. This unconventional plan was decidedly not domestic. Instead, it mirrored the classic suite of rooms typically found in English lodgings reserved for high-status guests. A dining chamber at the east end, let's see, there. A dining chamber at the east end here, was the principal events room in all likelihood, the provincial banquet hall. A great bedchamber for distinguished guests occupied the other end, here. The space in between sometimes served as an antechamber for the bedroom, that's here. At other times, it doubled as a drawing room into which a company of diners could withdraw between courses in the banquet hall, or when servants needed time to set up the dining chamber for another entertainment, a ball, for example. The middle room at Green Spring appears to have been just such a staging area. A flight of stairs behind the lodge rose to a narrow gangway. That platform was long enough to give backdoor access to both the dining chamber and the drawing room. In other words, servants from the kitchens down below could likely come and go through whichever door caused least inconvenience to Barclay's guests. For a time, no other building in Virginia was so adept at separating work and play, and so deft at orchestrating social interactions between the workers and the players. Barclay's 17th century building is the best known of these banquet houses owing to this watercolor sketch. It was drawn in 1796 by the famous British-born architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe. He'd been engaged to renovate what was by then the old hulk of the much earlier house into a modish gentleman's seat for William Ludwell Lee. As happens so often, patron and client had a falling out. Patron and architect had a falling out, but not before Latrobe made measurements of the ancient house, then almost 150 years old, and painted this attractive watercolor view. Attractive and indispensable. This sketch is a true Rosetta Stone, not only for deciphering Greenspring. It was the key that unlocked the whole mystery of banqueting houses generally. You might well ask, how did we get from this view of the house as Latrobe saw it with his own eyes at the end of the 18th century, all the way back to this conjectured view of the house and lodge as Barclay conceived them a century and a half earlier, especially when you recall that this thumbnail sketch is the only other eyewitness picture of the building. Latrobe's watercolor has been the starting point for many earlier attempts to work backwards to what might have been the original appearance of Greenspring. The problem always was that these conjectures never ended up looking like any recognizable 17th century building, American or English. We now know why, and Latrobe's meticulous drawing holds the answers. By 1796, the old banqueting house had undergone many renovations. It had become the Ludwell's principal mansion house when Barclay's even older dwelling attached to it was torn down, probably in the second quarter of the 18th century. That date is strongly suggested by several features that Latrobe faithfully recorded in this sketch. For instance, his drawing shows that a roofed veranda across the front had replaced the old open gallery. These long covered porches were a brand new innovation of the 18th century in the Chesapeake colonies. They were called piazzas. Close inspection of the drawing also shows that window openings for old-fashioned casements had been enlarged and refitted with sliding sash windows. They were another strictly 18th century improvement. Most anachronistic of all are the dormer windows. Shed dormers, mounted on the slope of a roof, were not the usual way to bring daylight into attic rooms in 17th century buildings. Not in Virginia, not in Britain. Front-facing gables were the rule instead. As you can see in this typical English example, the walls below extend up into the attic story. They're usually covered with a separate roof set at right angles to the principal roof, hence the front-facing gables. Now, what do we see if we take a very close look at Latrobe's drawing? Where he shows the dilapidated porch roof fallen down, it's obvious that the front wall extended 2 or 3 feet into the space reserved for upstairs chambers. Latrobe's own measurements actually tell us how high that wall rose above the attic floor, 2 feet, 9 inches. We then used his figures to draw this measured section. And from that, we restored 4 large gables to the front of Greenspring and thereby gave back its original 17th century personality. From this, backwards in time, to this. No wonder Lady Barclay called Greenspring the finest seat in America and the only tolerable place for a governor. I know I've tested your patience while I sort out this architectural puzzle. I won't do it again. I ask your forbearance only this once because I want everybody to know that I'm not just making this stuff up. As I explained at the beginning, this new thinking about Greenspring Lodge and the other banqueting houses as well does not result from newly discovered documents or even from new excavations for the most part. Instead, it comes from the careful re-examination of evidence that has been known to scholars for 40 years or more. It comes from the kind of creative teamwork that has brought together talented specialists from Colonial Williamsburg, Mary Washington University, the Park Service, and elsewhere. Now, let's take a brief next look at the party house Lewis Burrell built at Fairfield. By 1694, better ways had been found to provide service access from basement kitchens to public rooms upstairs. Not only that, but the middle room, the withdrawing room, was already well towards becoming both a reception hall and a formal passage. At Fairfield, it still gave access to 3 entertaining spaces. A large ballroom, actually called that many years later, a parlor or supper room on the other side, and a third heated room at the far end, conceivably still a quasi-public private great bedchamber. The structure was monumental in scale, even for a gentry house of the period in Virginia. The brick walls of the one-story front range soared 18 feet to the cornice. Some of its refinements were as up-to-date as any to be seen in suburban London before 1700. A hip roof and dormers rather than gables, for instance. Flemish-bound walls patterned with glazed headers, extra-large rectangular window openings almost certainly fitted with newfangled double-hung sash frames and a fully developed modillion cornice. Like Greenspring, there was a special reason to raise the principal entertaining rooms over a high basement at Fairfield. They appear to have opened out onto an elevated veranda that ran full length across the front. The veranda here seems to have served the same purpose as a belvedere or overlook that gave partygoers a fine view into a formal garden. That garden has not yet been excavated, but 2 or 3 unusual artifacts strongly imply its presence and vouch for its sophistication. One was this curious object. It's made of a fine white marble. This technical drawing better illustrates the delicately carved dolphin heads and Baroque-style flat foliage. They're typical of British work of the period 1695 to about 1720. What was this thing? A garden ornament, specifically the bulb supporting a large vase or finial. Such ornaments frequently stood on plinths in formal gardens or were set up on gate piers. Here you see a similar finial in the palace garden at Williamsburg. Burrell's banqueting lodge was one of the most advanced domestic structures built anywhere in the American colonies before 1700. Its form, proportions, fenestration, and trim work rivaled the kind of mature classicism that Londoners were just beginning to learn in the last quarter of the 17th century. In Virginia, Fairfield prefigured the governor's palace at Williamsburg by almost 15 years. Where did such innovations originate? Lewis Burrell himself never ventured outside the colonies. Where then did the radically modern design for his high-fashion party house come from? Most intriguing of all, what does such an avant-garde building imply about the sophisticated assemblies that it was built to perform? Burrell's few surviving papers give no clue. Historians can only surmise that his trend-setting tastes did not stop at the door. Which finally brings us to another door, back to Cora Toman. That's the party house that King Carter finished in 1727 and the one that burned to the ground 2 years later. By then, the ambiguities still present in the floor plan at Fairfield had been resolved. All the bedchambers for Carter's overnight guests had moved upstairs. That left the grand tier entirely free for daytime and evening entertainment. The largest room, here, was the scene of banquets and assemblies. The wide central stair hall, here, welcomed partygoers who entered through a doorway on the land side and showed them out the other end onto the now familiar balustrade gallery with sweeping views of the river. Once Carter's fetes were in full swing, this passage funneled diners and dancers into what was most likely a supper room or parlor for refreshments, cards, and conversation, here. Very large closets adjoined both the ballroom and the supper room. In the one that served the banquet ballroom, archaeologists found the remains of assorted props used in the merrymaking that went on there. Parts of musical instruments, swords, spurs, and other regalia accessorized the pomp and tomfoolery that were everywhere on parade in the gallant romps that Carter began holding at his party house in the summer of 1727. A Beau Nash presided over these dancing assemblies, as they were known. His name was Charles Stagg. Carter brought him up from Williamsburg, where he made a living as a dancing master and theater manager. Advertisements in the Virginia Gazette tell us that his wife ran a catering business, conveniently. Together, they were Williamsburg's first events planners. Carter's ledgers record that he hired Charles to oversee the ball and paid Mrs. Stagg for so-called sweetmeats. Sweetmeats top the list of traditional party foods, along with marzipan, nuts and fruit, spiced cakes, suckets, and other assorted delicacies. Robert Carter's short-lived lodge at Coratoman appears to have caught the refinement of gentry culture at a critical turning point. It was still a private clubhouse, built for that specific purpose, and staffed on special occasions by a master of ceremonies hired up from Williamsburg. On the other hand, its advanced layout of rooms anticipated the standardized gentry house that matured in the second half of the 18th century. Grand dining chamber and sometimes ballroom on one side, parlor or supper room opposite, both entered from a central stair passage. Old-fashioned banqueting lodge and newfangled gentleman's dwelling house were becoming indistinguishable. Colonial Williamsburg and several other organizations in the wider region have employed archaeologists and field-working architectural historians for more than half a century. All told, they've spent small fortunes rediscovering the material world of the very early South, a world that otherwise has all but disappeared. Has it been money well spent? I was often asked that question when I worked for Colonial Williamsburg. My academic colleagues were especially skeptical. The three banqueting houses I've described this evening put their skepticism and my faith to the test. Barclay, Burrell, and Carter left other relics to posterity. Their diaries, letters, and account books amply record their lives as planters, merchants, and men of affairs. Their formal portraits show us their idealized self-images, if only in still life. Valuable as those are, I would argue that there's more to understanding a historical figure than gets remembered in documents or frozen in images. Archaeologists recover and rebuild the physical places that people in the past once inhabited. So doing, they recreate the larger settings in which those people lived and worked. When archaeologists are fortunate enough to collaborate with colleagues, they can push that inquiry even further. Curators and architectural historians can make educated guesses about how excavated structures were furnished and how furnished rooms actually functioned. Another group of collaborators, social historians, can take one step beyond that. They can plausibly populate those rooms with the men and women, family and friends, masters, slaves, and servants who use those specialized spaces day in and day out. So doing, historians resuscitate many otherwise unrecorded social activities that took place in the real-life physical worlds that documents tend to slight and portraits romanticize. Written words and recorded numbers tell us what people long ago thought about, how they expressed themselves, and how they made a living. Beyond that, to set them in motion, to give them room to act out their lives with others, that's the job for an entire team of archaeologists, curators, and historians. As I now bring this talk to a close, you might reasonably object that I'm hanging the argument I've presented here on pretty slender evidence, on a mere 3 excavated structures, plus one more if you count the banqueting house jointly built by the 4 gentlemen of Westmoreland County. But the number 3 is a powerful talisman for archaeologists. There's an old saying they often repeat. If you dig a site and find one solitary stone, it's probably just a historical accident. If you find 2 stones side by side, well, that too could be merely a coincidence. But 3 stones, any archaeologist will tell you, is clear, unequivocal evidence of intelligent design. 3 of anything is truth made manifest. My 3 banqueting houses are my pledge that I'm telling you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me Carter Hudgens 1 and Carter Hudgens 2.
Cary, thank you, and I can say there's a Carter Hudgens 3, so we're in good shape. Such innovative work, always educational, inspirational, and entertaining as well. I hope everybody's had a great evening tonight. I want to open up the floor briefly to questions, but if I can start off, this type of work and being out at Drayton Hall yesterday, can any of this thought be applied to Drayton Hall in the world of entertaining and just expanding our thought beyond purely a domestic structure?
Well, yes, as I even mentioned, and as I was reminded walking through Drayton Hall yesterday, there is a building built a decade or so later, which already shows the matured combination of uses that I have described in these, starting with these earlier 17th century buildings. I think what it underscores, Carter, is the importance of really understanding how those spaces were used. And they weren't always used the same way all the time. So it's a complicated story. They were used some ways when the family more or less was at home, and other times when Drayton Hall became a place of entertainment. How exactly were they used? That's a challenge for your staff, for you and your staff. But yes, I think a Drayton Hall looks to me to as a mature example, as something that has come of age from the materials and the buildings I've been describing for an earlier period.
All right. Any other questions this evening other than me? All right. One here.
I was wondering if you might tell me more so I can understand where these are located. Is Westmoreland in the Rappahannock area? Yes. Okay, and Northampton is on the eastern shore, so they're all considered Chesapeake colonies, is that correct?
The Chesapeake region is that part of both Maryland, Virginia, and we really think of the Albemarle of North Carolina as being an extension of that. Those territories that were watered by tributaries that emptied into the Chesapeake Bay. That's a geographical way of describing it. A better way probably is these 2-3 colonies participated in a common economy that required slave labor, that therefore produced plantations that have much in common with one another, whether they're large plantations or farms. Nevertheless, they're organized, physically organized in ways that are similar among themselves, but quite different from the organization of farms and farm buildings, for example, in the valley. And in South Carolina, too, in a different way. So yes, the 3 buildings I talked about tonight. Green Spring is 4 miles outside of Jamestown, so really on the James River. Coratoman is on the northern neck. Is that the north? On the northern neck. Sometimes I get the necks. Lose track of one. On the northern neck, so on its up a couple of rivers. Westmoreland County is also in that part of northern Virginia, just south of the Potomac. What am I missing? Fairfield. Fairfield is in Gloucester County, just across the river from Williamsburg in Gloucester. I said that in Gloucester County, across the York River. You remind me that this talk to a non-Virginia audience would be improved with a map. And I will, if I give it again, I'll try to remember that. Thank you.
All right.